Exodus chapter 3. We're going to be in the whole chapter today. Last week we did 3 verses. Today we are going to do a whole chapter. So I'm actually going to read the entire chapter right here up front, and then we are going to dive in. Starting Exodus 3:1. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness, came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he turned aside, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses, and he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near, take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings. And I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now, behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppressed them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I, that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? He said, But I will be with you. And this shall be the sign for you, that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. Then Moses said to God, If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, Say this to the people of Israel, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever. And thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. Go, gather the elders of Israel together, and say to them, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I observed you, and what has been done to you in Egypt. And I promise that I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. And they will listen to your voice. And you and the elders of Israel shall go to the king of Egypt and say to him, The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us, and now please let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go, unless compelled by a mighty hand. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all the wonders that I will do in it. After that, he will let you go. And I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. And when you go, you shall not go empty. But each woman shall ask of her neighbor and any woman who lives in her house for silver and gold jewelry and for clothing. You shall put them on your sons and your daughters, so you shall plunder the Egyptians. Well, names are important, right? Names are important. I'm sure that all of us in here maybe have thought about at one time, what is the origin of my name, right? Some of us, our parents named us after a person who did something great. Anybody in here that's got a name like that? Some of us, our parents named us because they thought the name sounded cute. Anybody like that? My mom told me that I was named after her favorite soap opera character. She was a waitress at a restaurant, and so she would always work nights. And so during the day, she watched her favorite soap opera, All My Children. Anybody ever watch that? Pam loves that. And her favorite character was named Colton. I was pretty disappointed when I found that out. I mean, we all want our name to mean something great. No one is ever going to choose a name that means last place or always defeated, right? We were looking for names like the one from heaven who has victory, okay? Or warrior king, right? Something that shows power and strength that maybe has a deep meaning, or at least it means something to us, right? But here's what we're going to see today, okay? The name of God is so transcendent and powerful that the name of God cannot even be fully defined. It is amazing. And so let me give us some background first. Here we are at the beginning of Exodus chapter 3. Moses is keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro. He's in a desolate place far away from Egypt. He's in a very different place than he was just one chapter before. He has gone from prince to shepherd, from power to humility. And just an interesting note, back in Genesis, when Jacob and the Israelites were settling in Egypt, it records that they were shepherds. And we're told that to be a shepherd was to be an abomination to the Egyptians. So Moses has gone from prince, respected, educated, to an abomination in the eyes of the Egyptians, okay? And while he is tending to the flock of his father-in-law, something very strange happens. Let's look at verse 2 again. And an angel of the Lord appeared to him, and in a flame of fire, out of the midst of a bush, he looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. Now, just a little note here, because I was a little confused when I first read it. The angel of the Lord, when it says the angel of the Lord here, we have to know that that is the Lord himself. It reads a little confusing. 67 times in the Old Testament, you have this phrase, the angel of the Lord. And this specific phrase, you can translate it to the angel that is Yahweh or angel Yahweh. So I just wanted to get in front of that before someone asked, because I had the same question. And it's pretty obvious from the following verses that the angel, this angel that's mentioned here, is not like the other angels that we are told about, like Michael or Gabriel. And you see that pretty clearly in verse 4 of who this is. Verse 4, when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. So you see that God repeats Moses' name, Moses, Moses. Now God will do this several times throughout Scripture. It's a very common thing to see. Samuel, Samuel in 1 Samuel. Paul or Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Martha, Martha, Jesus says in Luke chapter 10. And here God says, Moses, Moses. Moses says, here I am. Verse 5, God asks Moses to remove his sandals. Now, why does God have Moses remove his sandals? Well, it's not just that the place where God is holy. Therefore, you take off your shoes. But if we're reading this through Eastern eyes, we would understand that when you enter into someone's house, you remove your shoes. So I think part of what God is saying here and doing is not only is this a holy place, Moses, but I also think it's an invitation. It's an invitation to Moses. Moses, take off your shoes and be with me here. Be present with me. Verse 6, we have God's proclamation of what he already declared to be true about himself in chapter 2, verse 24, what we talked about last week, that we were told that God remembered his covenant. And now God is going to reveal to Moses what God already knows about himself, that he is the God of covenant, and he has not forgotten a promise that he has ever made. In the same way, we see that in verse 7, God is beginning to act on what he has seen. Remember, last week we were told that God saw the people of Israel. And so now look at verse 7. It said, the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Now, before we move on, there are two terms that we must understand if we're going to understand this chapter, okay? We have to understand that God is both transcendent and God is immanent. So two theological terms that are helpful to understanding what's about to happen, okay? So to say that God is transcendent is to say that God is above us in every way. So God is the creator. He's the author. All things come from him and are for him. He transcends time and space. So God is outside of time. He is not confined to one specific moment or to one location. He is over all. He is outside of all, and God is above all. Psalm 57 will say that God is to be exalted. Okay? Psalm 8 says that God dwells above the heavens. Psalm 113 says that he is enthroned on high. Psalm 97 will say that he is himself the Most High. So God is above. He is greater than us. He is to be exalted on high. He is transcendent. God is in charge. There is one throne, and he's on it. Transcendent. But he is also immanent. Yeah, he is above us. He is transcendent, but he is also immanent. God is with us. God is among us. There is an all-powerful, mighty God who placed the stars in the sky, right? He made the seas. He controls time. He sovereignly reigns as king, but he also chooses to be with you. He chooses to be among us and to be with us. And you see this in verses 7 and 8. This moment is so important. I mean, think about it. The God who has all power and all authority, the God who exists outside of time, and he cannot be defined, that God, he hears our cries. You ever think about that? He hears our cries. He knows our suffering, and he has come down to deliver us. And in those moments of doubt and suffering, assurance is found in the confidence of knowing that God is with us, right? He's immanent. He sees, he hears, he knows, and he has come down. He's Emmanuel, God with us. And both of these realities, transcendence and immanence, they are important if our identity is going to be shaped by our faith in God. Because, think about it, if he's only transcendent, because he's fully transcendent and fully immanent, if he's only transcendent, what do we have? We have a God who exists in power, but he's not among us, right? So we believe in him, but really he makes no difference in our lives. And on the other side, if he's immanent, but he's not transcendent, he may care about you, but he has no real authority. At that point, his promises are as good as my promises. See, I care about you a lot, but I am so limited. I am limited, right? And so you can't rely on me that much. I will let you down. Maybe you don't put much weight in his word if he's not transcendent, right? Maybe there's no striving for holiness in light of his grace. And you will begin to compromise his words as if they are nothing because his power and authority holds little weight. And for the rest of this text, you are going to see those two themes throughout, that God is transcendent and God is immanent. And those realities are going to shape Moses. And if we pay attention, they will also shape us. So let's jump in. Verse 10, come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. Finally, after 2 chapters of silence, God declares his plan. He tells Moses, hey, I'm going to send you, and you will bring the people of God out of slavery and into Egypt. After centuries of crying out, centuries of groaning, God is now declaring what is about to happen. What an invitation from God to Moses, right? What an invitation. I mean, surely Moses is going to be excited. I mean, think about it. He's sitting in front of a bush that is on fire and not burning. The God of Abraham is now declaring, inviting him to be the vessel to which God will use to free the people of Israel, the same people that he tried to defend himself when he killed an Egyptian, the same people that rejected his leadership back in chapter 2. The God of Abraham is now declaring, I am sending you to lead my people out of Egypt. You think that Moses would be stoked about this. After all, this is what he wanted all those years ago. When he looked upon the slavery of his people and he decided to do something about it, but then he had to flee to the wilderness. And so what does Moses say in response to this invitation? Verse 11, Moses said to God, who am I that should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? He says, who am I? So think about it. How many of us have missed the great invitation to be used by God because we just can't see past ourselves? I love that Moses asked the question, and God doesn't really give him an answer here, right? Moses says, who am I? And God doesn't respond with, come on, man, you're Moses. You're the guy who grew up in Pharaoh's house. You know how they think. You know how they operate. So Moses, you're uniquely positioned to do this. No, he doesn't do that. He doesn't point to anything in Moses. God just responds with, hey, I'll be there. I'll be there. So Moses asked a question that I think is based on his fear It's based on his insecurity. That question, it's based on who Moses is and not on who God is. This is honestly just poor theology from Moses. Simply put, it is bad theology. And bad theology starts when we attempt to view God through the lens of self. The great tragedy here is that Moses is viewing this invitation not based on what he sees right in front of him, that God is talking to him, a bush that is not burning, that it is holy ground that Moses is standing on. The great tragedy is that Moses cannot truly see who God is, what he is capable of, and the assurance of the words of God. He can't see it because he's attempting to view who God is or what God can do through the lens of who Moses knows Moses to be. Okay, God, I know you're saying this, but man, I know that I'm like this. I mean, therefore, that must mean that, God, you can't do this. Who am I? How many of us do this? We all make assumptions about ourselves, and then we put those things on God and then falsely assume him to be something that he's not. We all assume that we know what we're capable of. We all assume that we know what our limitations are. And then when God tells us that he's going to do something through us, what happens? We say, who am I? God, are you sure? Like, are you sure? Right? Don't you know who I am? Don't you know what I've done? So let me say this, and let me caveat this with, I love you. And I'm so happy that you're here. But I think one of the reasons that you can't be free of that sin, one of the reasons you can't forgive that person, one of the reasons that you still feel that anger, one of the reasons you still can't forgive yourself and live in the freedom and the shed blood of Christ, one of the reasons that you can't do what God is asking you to do is because you are so consumed with self that you have completely misunderstood who God is. And the tragedy for us is we assume that who we are is equal to the power, authority, and nature of God. And I love that God looks at Moses and he says, but I will be with you. But I will be with you. See, when God is with us, who we are, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter what we have done. It doesn't matter how gifted we think we are. It doesn't matter what we think we can do or what we can't do. When God is with us, all that matters is what he chooses to do. And when we realize who he is, we move out of the way. We move out of the way. But Moses here, he can't get out of the way. He's still worried, and understandably, to be honest. I mean, he's scared. He's already tried to save the Israelites, and he failed miserably. And maybe he just can't see past that, and so he asks God another question, because Moses, understandably, wants some assurances here. Maybe he thinks, man, no one's going to believe me when I try to tell them this, right? Like, imagine him telling that story. Look, guys, I've been up in Midian for 40 years. One day I was taking care of my father-in-law's sheep, and I saw this bush. It was on fire, but it wasn't burning. Like, does that make sense? You get what I'm saying? Like, it's on fire, but it's not burning. Like, can you understand that? And they're like, oh, well, what do you mean? He's like, it's on fire, bro. Like, it's not, but it's still there. And then he's like, and then it spoke to me. And God said to me, Moses, hey, I'm going to send you and go talk to the elders, and I'm going to send you, and you're going to lead us out of Egypt. Is anybody going to believe him? I think maybe he thinks that they won't. And so he's scared. So he asked God a question, verse 13. Then Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of our fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel. I am has sent me to you. And here we have one of the most important moments in all of Scripture. God says, I am who I am. Now, what is going on here? It can be a little confusing because it almost sounds like God isn't really answering the question, right? At least that's how I first thought about it. God, like, okay, God, you didn't say your name. Like, what is your actual name? You didn't answer the question. So let me simply give you an analogy to start this off. Okay, think about it like this. Say I called my wife's phone and someone else answered the phone and I said, hey, is Katie there? And they said, can I ask who's calling? And I said, it's her husband. And if they said, which husband? I would say, the only one, the one who was, who is, and will always be, right? God is saying here, I am who I am. I am the one who was. I am the one who is. I am the one who always will be. There is none other like me. And so let's make sure we get this right because this is incredibly important. In Hebrew, it's the phrase, ayeh, asher, ayeh. Ayeh, asher, ayeh. Asher in the middle is a particle that connects two verbs. So, and it can be translated, so asher can be translated who, that, and because. The two verbs, ayeh, can be translated I am, I was, or I will be. So all of those things can be true in this form of the verb. So there are 9 different ways that this can be translated into English. So it could be I am who I am. It could be I was that I was. It could be I will be because I will be. It could be I will be who I will be. That's my favorite one to say. I will be who I will be, right? And you can mix and match those, and all of that still be true. Most English translations give us I am who I am, which is more than appropriate, especially since the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, translates it that way. That would have been the version that Jesus and his disciples would have been familiar with. It translates to ego eimi, I am. Now we're done with our Hebrew lesson. Here's what we have to understand. As much as we want to define and put parameters on God, we must first understand and grab the truth that God can never be fully defined. God can never be fully defined. Moses wants to define God in this moment so he can explain him. He wants the assurance to be able to explain who God is so that the Israelites will accept him, and we're all attempted to do this. Because when we try to explain God, many of the times we change who he is. We're all tempted to do it. We want to put God in a category. We want him to fit into a nice little box that we fully understand. But here's the thing. God is completely self-defining. He is who he is. We don't tell him who he is. And many times, and many people do this in our culture today, where we play a dangerous game when we try to make God in our own image. We want to believe that we get to define who God is. We want to read the scriptures, right? Where we read it and we say, I don't think that God would do that. Well, there's your problem, right? We're trying to tell God who he is, but you and I, we don't have that right. We try to make God a concept and not a truth. Because if God is a concept of who he could be rather than who he is, then he could be bent to be like us. But God's not a concept. He's a truth, and his holiness and his power cannot be bent. And this is why it's important that we have to take what God's word says seriously and not try to twist it and bend it to who we are. It's like me coming up to you and saying, hey, what's your favorite kind of bird? And you say, a golden retriever. And I say, a golden retriever isn't a bird. And if you stake your flag into that concept that a golden retriever is a bird, at some point I have to bow out of that conversation because you're staking on something that's not really possible. It's not, a golden retriever isn't defined that way. And we say things like, well, I just don't think that God would. Or I just can't believe in a God that would. Like, we have to understand that what we think or assume God would or wouldn't do, it just doesn't matter. God defines who God is, and he decides what he does, not us. And that is exactly what God is doing here with Moses. Moses says, who do I tell them is sending me? And God says, you tell them I am who I am. Moses, you can't explain me. You can't explain me. I am the God who was. I am the God who is. I am the God who will be. I am the God who is at creation. I am the God who is present with you. I am the God who will be with you at the end of all things. I mean, have you ever considered that in the very first verse of the Bible, when Genesis 1:1 says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That here, we not only meet God as creator, but we also meet God in his aseity. So that word, aseity, A-S-E-I-T-Y, aseity, it means that he is sufficient to himself, that God is independent of anything outside of himself. Aseity is a Latin word that means in himself. So God exists in himself. He doesn't need to go outside of himself to find purpose or life. You and I, we were dependent on a creator. We're dependent on other people. We are dependent on food, on things to live and to breathe. God is not dependent on anything. He's not dependent on anyone. I mean, forever. Like, have you ever looked out at the stars and thought, wow, for all time, forever, there has always been someone there. Like, before the stars were there, before the sky was a thing, right? There was never nothing. There was never a time when God was not. Does that make sense? It's his aseity. Now, because he is transcendent, because he is in his aseity, because he is who he is, there is available to us a confidence in his promises that isn't available anywhere else. And why is that? Because God doesn't talk in maybes. God doesn't talk in maybes. He doesn't say here, hey, go to the Israelites and they might listen. He doesn't say, hey, I might destroy Pharaoh. He says, you will go. They will listen. This will happen. It's certain because he is certain. He is who he is. And listen, he goes on, he says, Moses, I'm the God who made a promise. I am the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and Jacob. Let's remember that God's statement, I am who I am, it's a response to a question. And it's a question that is asked out of insecurity. God is asking Moses to do something that he's kind of rightly terrified by. After all of his failure, after all of these years, God is sending Moses to do something that he has already failed at, okay? He has to be so scared of failure, scared of being rejected. I mean, after all, he's got a family now. He's not just some single prince in Egypt. He's got responsibilities. And I think this is God's way of saying, hey, I know you're scared. I know you failed, but Moses, look at me. I am who I am. And I am sending you. So consider that sin that you just feel so enslaved to. It scares you, doesn't it? That you can't shake it. No matter what you try, you just return to it over and over. For those of you that are married, it scares you that your marriage might fail, doesn't it? Things don't seem to be going that well, and so you're terrified. Or how about sharing the gospel with that friend that you know God is calling you to share the gospel with? Or how about the thought, maybe God is calling me to move my family to the nations? Do you start with the question, who am I? Or do you look at him who says, I am who I am? Let's remember who frees you from that sin and calls you into freedom. Let's remember who called you into marriage and has made you one. Let's remember who has commanded you to share the gospel. Let's remember who calls you to go and make disciples of all nations. It is the I am who I am, and when he declares it, he will do it. And all throughout this text, over and over, God is reminding Moses, I will be with you. I will be with you. I will be with you. I mean, do we not realize when we pray who we are praying to? I think we minimize who God is way too often. I remember when I was in college, I was in a small group at our church, and the guy who was leading the Bible study started diving deep into some theological truths about the divinity of Jesus. And one of the guys finally said, hey, look, man, all this is way too deep for me. I just like to think of Jesus as my homeboy. And the Bible study leader said, hey, man, that's fine. But here's what you have to realize. Jesus is not just your homie, but he is the homie of all homies. And that guy kind of sat back, and it literally changed his life, thinking about Jesus as the homie of all homies. And he got serious. He's a pastor now. He got serious about who Jesus was. And so however you think of who God is, right? Maybe you think of God as your friend. That's fine. But he's not just your friend. He is the friend of all friends. There is no friend like him. Maybe you think of God as your refuge, and that's beautiful. But you have to understand, he's not just a refuge. He is the refuge of all refuges. There's no one like him. Whatever you run to, he's better, he's superior. And consider this. The I am here is also Emmanuel, God with us. So let me take you to the Gospels in John chapter 8. I've said this before in here, but you probably don't remember, so that's okay. John chapter 8, verse 56. I want to show you something. This is Jesus talking. He's talking to a group of Jewish people. And he says, your father Abraham, it should be on the screen for you. Your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad. So the Jews said to him, you are not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham? And Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, and then what does Jesus say? I am. So let's think about this. He says to the Jews, your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day, which, just reading that as it's written, it would lead us to believe that Jesus was present with Abraham when he was alive. But notice, Jesus did not simply say, before Abraham was, I was, which would simply mean that Jesus is maybe more than 2,000 years old, which is why they say, hey, you're not even 50 years old yet. How do you know Abraham? It's a normal question, right? But he doesn't say before Abraham was, I was. He uses the name, I am. Before Abraham was, I am. Now, where have we heard that before? Exodus chapter 3. It's the phrase, ego eimi. What's the name that God uses in Exodus 3? In the Septuagint, it's the same name, ego eimi. Now, let me show you something else. When the soldiers come to arrest Jesus in the Gospels, we're told in John 18, so if you have your Bible, go look at John chapter 18, verses 4 through 7. This is right after the Lord's Supper, right after Jesus prays in the Garden of Gethsemane, right before Jesus goes to the cross. Judas has led hundreds of soldiers. So the Greek word there, spiro, is the word for cohort, meaning that potentially there could be 300 to 600 soldiers coming to arrest Jesus. And then we get this in John 18:4. Then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward and said to them, whom do you seek? They answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus said to them, I am he. Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When Jesus said to them, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. Think about that. He says, ego eimi, I am, and just him speaking that name is so powerful that hundreds of soldiers fall to the ground. He is the God who was. He is the God who is. He's the God who will be. And what we forget so often is that he is the God that we need. That we need him. Something else I want to show us in verses 13 through 15. So look at verse 15. It says, God also said this to Moses. This is Exodus 3. God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel. The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I'm to be remembered throughout all generations. So in verse 14, we have God defining himself as I am who I am, right? And then in verse 15, he calls himself the Lord. Now, why is this significant? I am, so I am who I am. I am is the verb, ehyeh. This is seldom used by God to describe himself in the Old Testament, okay? Now, the Lord is a little bit familiar. You're probably familiar with it. Yahweh. It appears around 7,000 times. 7,000 times in your Old Testament. In the Hebrew, you'll see it often as 4 consonant letters, YWHW. Sometimes it will appear as JHVH. It's called the tetragrammaton. It's a fun word to say, tetragrammaton. A fancy way of saying it's 4 consonant letters with no vowels, which is how Hebrew is written. In most of our Bibles, we will see it translated as the Lord, capital letters, okay? Now, Yahweh comes from the Hebrew verb hayah, meaning to be. It's the same root verb as I am, ehyeh. So, if you can remember one word from our Exodus text, remember hayah. Now, the name Yahweh, I'm getting somewhere with this. Stay with me. Stay with me. Now, the name Yahweh was known all throughout Genesis, okay? So, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they all called on the Lord, Yahweh. But it would seem here that the name of God had been forgotten. That's the assumption here. The people of God had been enslaved for 400 years. That's longer than America has been a country. Moses has been in Midian for 40 years. You may have noticed that there is no mention of the name of God in Exodus 1 and 2. You have people who fear God. You have people who call out in their suffering, but no one is calling on the covenant name of God, Yahweh. So we're led to believe that God's name, perhaps, has been lost. That the people of Israel no longer remember the God who made a covenant with them. And so God tells Moses, tell them that I am. And he tells them, tell them that I am Yahweh, the Lord. The God of your fathers has sent me to them. This is God reintroducing himself to the people of Israel. And God says, this is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. So now let me ask you a question. Have you forgotten the name of God? Like, has your suffering drowned out his name? Have you been too distracted, too busy, too consumed with stuff or self to think on who it is, to think on what his name is? He is the I am who I am. He is transcendent. He is above, self-reliant, self-existent. He defines himself, yet he is immanent. He is the Lord. He is present. He loves you so much. He hears you. He sees you. He knows you. My one prayer for us today is that we would stop to consider his name, because it means something. The power of his name, the intimacy of his name, and understand that just like Moses, he's called to each of us, not from a burning bush, but through his Spirit and through his word. And we are told that the Spirit draws us to the Lord. Ephesians 1 tells us that God knew your name, that he chose you before the foundation of the world. That, think about it, God has told us his name. Now the question is, what are the implications of that for you and I? Will we, like Moses, say, well, who am I? Will we try to view God through who we think we are, or will we surrender to the I am and listen to what he has to say about himself? So, why does this matter? Why should the name of God matter to you? Well, we don't have time to read verses 16 through 21, but I want to point something out. Notice how God communicates when he talks about what is going to happen next. Okay, notice how he communicates when he talks about what is about to happen. So he tells Moses, I promise that I will bring you out of affliction, verse 17. He tells him, hey, they will listen to your voice, verse 18. He tells him, but I know the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand, verse 19. So he says, I will stretch out my hand, verse 20. I will give this people favor, verse 21. So you shall plunder the Egyptians, verse 22. God seems to be pretty certain as to what is about to happen. So we have to ask on this side of the text, was he right? Was God right in what he said? Did the king of Egypt not let them go until he was compelled by a mighty hand? Yeah. Did God stretch out his hand? Yeah. And if the great I am was right about that, the question is, what else is he right about? So let me read you a text out of Revelation 21. And as I'm reading it, I want you to listen to what God says is going to happen. And ask yourself, do I believe him? So Revelation 21, verse 1, this is our future. We're told, I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death shall be no more. Neither shall be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. And he who was seated on the throne said, behold, I am making all things new. And he said, write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true. And he said to me, it is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give from the spring of the water of life without payment. So what is the great I am declaring in this text? He says the dwelling place of God is with man. He says they will be his people. He says that he will wipe away every tear, that death shall be no more, that there's no mourning, no crying, no pain. He says that he's going to make all things new. He's going to declare one day that it is done. And he says to the thirsty, I will give the water of life without payment. And here's the question for us. Do we believe him? Here's why this matters. If what God says about himself, if what God says about us, and if what God says about what will happen in the future is true, then the best place for us is to be completely dependent on him and complete worship of his name. This is why Jesus says in Matthew 11:28, come to me. Come to me. Come to me who labor and are heavy laden, and I will what? I will give you rest. Why does he have the authority to say that? If I said that to you, that'd be kind of weird. Hey, come to me. I'll give you rest. No, I don't have the power to do that. Come to me, and he's the sovereign one, the creator of all things, self-existing, self-defining. He's El Shaddai. He's Jehovah. He's Emmanuel. He is I am who I am. He is Yahweh. And he says, hey, you come to me, all who labor, all who are heavy laden. Don't run to that sin. Don't run to creature comforts. Don't run to entertainment to numb your mind. You run to your creator, to your Savior, to your sustainer, who has set his affections on you in grace. The question, who am I, does not need to exist in our vocabulary. It's, who are you? Because he defines who we are, and in his shelter, we find rest. Because he's better than anything else.